Before we get started, I just want to give a little disclaimer. Please refrain from recording any audio or video or taking screenshots during today's webinar. This presentation and the corresponding slides are copyrighted by Robson Forensic and may not be recorded, copied, distributed, or otherwise used without authorization. Our presentation today is on restrictive housing and the role of wellness checks in correctional environments. Our presenter is my colleague, Paul Adee. He's a member of our police practices and security group. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can submit them to us via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, or you can email us at inquiries@robsonforensic.com, and we'll get to those questions at the end. So with that, I will hand it over to Paul.
Thank you, Ann. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here today. I'd like to begin my presentation by providing you with a brief synopsis of my experiences and qualifications. I started my career in corrections at the Winnebago County Jail in Rockford, Illinois in 1988. My wife and I moved to Florida, and I began working for the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office in Tampa in 1991, where I enjoyed a very rewarding 30-year career. I was very fortunate and had many opportunities. I held positions that touched virtually every facet of jail operations. I held several positions of progressive leadership. I started as a deputy, became a field training officer, and then a supervisor, a shift commander, a deputy division commander, and ultimately I retired at the rank of major, which is a division commander. The first 17 years of my career, I spent working the floors as a deputy and housing unit and booking supervisor. I then spent 2.5 years as the detention training sergeant. From there, I was promoted to the rank of lieutenant and became a shift commander, then the Transportation Bureau commander, and the Judicial Protection Bureau commander, where I was responsible for courtroom security. My division commander assignments included the Orient Road Jail, which can house 1,700 inmates, the Falkenberg Road Jail, which can house 3,300 inmates, the Inmate Support Services Division, which consisted of inmate healthcare, transportation, food service, and all of the ancillary support functions that kept the facilities running. The Training Division for the entire agency, and the Court Operations Division. I'm a certified corrections manager through the American Correctional Association and a certified correctional health professional through the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare. My casework typically involves inmate deaths, assaults, excessive use of force claims, and conditions of confinement. We are here today to discuss restrictive housing and the role of well-being or wellness checks. Those terms are interchangeable. Although many individual states have enacted either statutory or administrative regulations regarding jail and prison operations, they tend to be pretty vague. The standard of care regarding jail and prison operations remains consistent throughout the country. When I conduct forensic investigations of incidents regarding jail and prison operations, I look at the standard of care as well as state statutes and regulations. There's many moving parts when operating a jail or prison. Adequate policies and procedures, training, and supervision all play a role to ensure facilities are operating within the standard of care. Booking, restrictive housing, and inmate health care tend to be the areas that jails and prisons get themselves into troubles with. 2 out of the 3 of these areas, restrictive housing and inmate health care, are why we are here today. Throughout history, restrictive housing has been commonly referred to as solitary confinement, the SHU or special housing unit, isolation, or even the hole. There are different types of and reasons for placing someone in restrictive housing. An inmate may be placed in administrative confinement due to their current or prior institutional behavior and repeated nonconformance to facility rules and regulations. Those that find themselves in disciplinary confinement have been found guilty of breaking facility rules and have been placed there as a result. Those in protective custody are there for their own protection. This was either self-initiated or initiated by a staff member and is typically based on the inmate's current or past charges, their position within the community. They may be a celebrity, current or former law enforcement officer, clergy member, or hold some other position of influence within the community. or the inmate may be known as an informant. Jails across the country have become the de facto mental health institutions for their communities. It's not uncommon to have anywhere from a quarter to a third of the inmates within the facility to have either a diagnosed or undiagnosed mental illness. Some are receiving treatment and some are not for various reasons. In my experience, most of these inmates are able to live in the general population with other inmates. However, some of them display behaviors that disrupt the orderly running of the institution, or they become a target for victimization by other inmates. For those that are not capable of living in general population, for those reasons, or due to their suicidality, many facilities house them in a form of restrictive housing at the direction of medical or mental health professionals. For all intents and purposes, these inmates have the same living conditions as those inmates assigned to administrative and disciplinary segregation, as well as protective custody. Inmates in psychiatric observation oftentimes fall between the cracks because they don't care for or advocate for themselves for a number of reasons. In all instances, whether the inmate is in general population or restrictive housing, agencies must take reasonable steps to ensure the inmates are safe. It is even more critical if the inmate has been identified as someone requiring enhanced observations such as those I just mentioned. Wellness and well-being checks. I've literally conducted hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of these types of checks throughout my career. I also supervise those responsible for conducting them, and as a jail administrator, I enacted measures to ensuring supervisory staff observed and audited these checks by reviewing observation logs and video surveillance in conjunction with conducting their supervisory rounds. Monitoring the inmates is probably the most important role correctional officers assume regarding suicide prevention and response thereto. Let's talk about the officer's responsibilities. Checks are supposed to be conducted within 15 to 30-minute intervals, depending upon the circumstances. They are to be conducted in a staggered and unpredictable manner. This is to keep the inmates guessing on when the officer is going to appear in an effort to limit or reduce suicide attempts, rule violations, and anything else the inmate shouldn't be doing. When observing the inmates, officers are ensuring the inmate is alive and breathing, not injured or attempting to injure themselves. They should take notice if the inmate is in some form of physical or mental health crisis, or if their overall condition is deteriorating. Observing the condition of the inmate's cell is also part of this process. Officers must report abnormalities to the appropriate people or entities, meaning their supervisor, medical or mental health professionals, and possibly classification personnel. Officers should document relevant information in the inmate's file and possibly in an incident report, depending upon the situation. Well-being checks are captured manually with pen and paper or electronically, utilizing an RFID tag and an electronic recording device similar to a cell phone or a pipe system like mall security uses. What really happens during these checks? Oftentimes, officers use timers to notify them when to do their checks, making them very predictable. For those agencies that still utilize pen and paper, double taps tend to occur. This is when officers are logging two entries during one check, and they're either late on one check and early on the other, or they conduct drive-bys, sometimes without even breaking stride as they're walking past the inmate's cell. These tend to be cursory type checks that are conducted within a few seconds. Video surveillance footage helps me during my investigations into these matters because I can actually observe how they're doing their checks and if they are drive-bys or not. Agencies have an obligation to supervise employees. To that end, let's discuss supervision of staff and inmates in the restrictive housing unit. Supervisors must visit each inmate within the restrictive housing unit each shift and must provide ongoing supervision of their employees. They are to ensure that staff are conducting checks as required from a timing standpoint and ensuring that the checks are adequate and meaningful in time and form and not merely a drive-by. When they are observing and talking to the inmates, They should take note to identify if the inmate's physical condition or mental health is deteriorating. They have the same obligation as officers do as it relates to notifying the appropriate personnel if this is the case. What really happens during supervisory oversight? Oftentimes, supervisors are not paying attention to the actual process regarding how and when the officers conduct their checks. Many supervisors are simply checking the proverbial box in that they showed up in the area as required and signed paperwork to prove that they were there. However, they're not actually conducting reviews and audits to ensure the officers' wellness checks are being conducted adequately. Excuse me. Medical and mental health staff must also conduct regular predetermined visits with those inmates in restrictive housing to observe and assess their condition for changes in physical or mental health and document their findings in the inmate's medical chart. This may include noting that the inmate is showing signs of psychosis, they are withdrawn, not fulfilling their activities of daily living, displaying poor self-care, or if they have physical injuries or deformities, or whether or not the inmate has taken or refused their prescribed medications. What really happens? Oftentimes, medical personnel are fulfilling several functions at one time. They may be passing medications and conducting patient assessments at the same time. Capturing the required information is tricky when this occurs. If they utilize an electronic health record, they may record information at the time it is observed if they desire. Some do and some don't. However, if they still use pen and paper, they typically take down notes and transcribe them into the chart at a later time. Does this actually occur or not? Sometimes it's probably the best answer to that question. I've heard many medical professionals indicate that they chart by exception. Unless they identify an abnormality, they don't write anything down in the chart. Classification reviews are conducted to ensure that the reason for each inmate's housing and classification status is still valid, that appropriate resources are being provided to the inmate, and the condition of each inmate is discussed. These reviews are conducted by a team of multidisciplinary professionals, meaning the officers assigned to the unit, their supervisors, medical and mental health professionals, and classification personnel. The timing of these reviews is dependent upon how long someone has been in restrictive housing. My forensic investigations include examination of policies and procedures and post orders. Are they adequate? Are they contradictory? Officer and supervisory training. Have the staff members received training as required? If so, was it adequate? Does the training contradict or support the policies and procedures and post orders? Wellness and well-being check logs and videos. Are the checks adequate in timing and form? Supervisory rounds. Are supervisors entering the area as required? If so, how long are they there? Are they providing adequate supervision? When reviewing logs and communications between the various entities that work within the jail facility, I'm looking at what was said by one party and how it was responded to by the other party, if at all. Medical records. I'm very adept at reviewing patient charts. I conducted hundreds of chart reviews while overseeing the delivery of inmate healthcare at my agency. I also regularly review patient charts during my forensic investigations. Based on my experience and the NCCHC certification that I possess, I can opine on the administration of the delivery of inmate healthcare. However, I'm not a clinician and I cannot opine on clinical matters. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them at this time.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was awesome. Again, you can submit questions to us through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can email us or submit a web inquiry form if you have a case that you'd like to discuss so we can clear conflicts. Aside from that, though, in terms of correctional healthcare, you mentioned that you're not a clinician, you can't opine on clinical matters. So what do those kind of what do those cases look like for you in terms of how are you applying your correctional healthcare certification?
So certain things are supposed to happen at certain intervals when an inmate is brought into the facility. The very first thing that's supposed to happen is they're supposed to have a medical screening conducted to make sure that they're even fit to be in the jail. That's one of the very first things that I would be looking at in virtually any case that I take that has a medical component to it. But then there's certain other things depending on if the person answers in the affirmative to certain questions, that's supposed to trigger other types of assessments and things to be done. And doing a chart review of the patient's chart, I'm able to tell if that actually occurred. I can't tell you that if it's adequate from a clinical standpoint, but whether it occurred or not, that matters. If it didn't occur, that's certainly a problem.
And we just had a question submitted, which, you know, you may or may not be able to answer this. Talking about what is the general law, case law on COs skipping wellness checks as deliberate indifference? Is that something that you can answer? We're not.
Yeah, that's not something that I'd be able to opine on whether that would qualify as deliberate indifference. That's more for a trier of fact or the judge to make that determination. I can tell you that if they are deliberately skipping them, there's big problems. Certainly, it's a standard of care issue, and if it is certainly if it's a customer practice, then you're getting into some Monell issues. But I don't necessarily see willful or conscious decisions frequently in my casework to skip these checks. But I oftentimes see a pattern where the officers are coming around exactly every 15 minutes if it's a 15-minute watch, or they're coming around every 14 minutes, but there's no variation there's no variation in the times that they're coming around.
And that kind of ties into something that you had spoken about in terms of like these double taps, or if a check is skipped, or, you know, keeping records of the timing of those, and what are the challenges in validating or disputing whether there was a double tap or whether a check was skipped if they have paper records.
Certainly if it's a pen and paper record, video is essential in proving that watches were being fabricated or double tapped, if you will. Without video, it's very hard to prove that. That's why many agencies at this point have gone to an electronic recording system.
Another question just got submitted. After an inmate is placed in segregated housing, do the officers performing the wellness checks have to communicate with the medical professionals on the inmate's medical/mental status? And if so, how often?
Only if only if their physical or mental health status is changing. Medical is supposed to be coming around at predetermined times to check the status, to check the inmate's status as well. But because the officers are with the inmates more than anybody else in the facility, they are really the eyes and ears of the medical department as well. So their interaction with medical is critical.
That's a great question. Anything else? Last chance to ask Paul. Otherwise, we'd love to connect with you offline, and all of our contact info is here. We're easy to find. It looks like that is going to be it for today. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Paul, for your insight and this wonderful presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody.